The house felt too quiet after he left, like someone had pressed a hand against its chest and told it not to breathe. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, still in the dress I'd married him in, the train pooling at my feet like a fading promise. The lights from the reception had gone out one by one, and in their place came a kind of stillness that felt watchful. The kind that settles in old houses when everyone leaves except the person who doesn't know where they belong. The evening stretched on, long after his footsteps had disappeared down the porch. I kept telling myself he'd return soon, 10 minutes, 20, but the clock on the dining room wall kept insisting otherwise, ticking with a stubborn, patient rhythm. I walked through the hallway, slow and careful, as though any sudden movement might wake something sleeping in the walls. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound bouncing ahead of me, too loud in a place that wasn't mine yet. On the walls, their families' photographs followed me with a familiarity I couldn't return. People smiling at beaches I'd never visited, holding babies I couldn't name, standing beside cars they'd probably traded in a decade ago. Most of the frames sat slightly crooked, just enough to be noticeable, as if someone had straightened them 1,000 times, or touched them every time they walked past. I reached out once, just to steady one of them, but pulled my hand back before my fingers made contact. I didn't want to disturb their ghosts. Not on my first night. Not when the dress around my shoulders still smelled of flowers and someone else's perfume. Downstairs, the remnants of the reception looked strangely abandoned. Half-full glasses glimmered in the low light, capturing reflections of no one. Ribbons lay wilted on the floor, the bows coming undone, tired from being tied too tight all day. A slice of cake sat untouched, the frosting already softening at the edges. It all felt like a party that ended without permission, like the room kept waiting for music that would never return. I checked my phone again. No messages. Not from Elias. Not even the courtesy of a "be back soon." The silence after that felt heavier. I moved back toward the stairs, my feet dragging a little, the train whispering along the polished wood. The house wasn't large, not really, but the way the light fell made every shadow stretch too far, made the corners look deeper than they should. When I reached the landing, the air felt different, cooler, like someone had opened a window I couldn't see. I hesitated there, one hand on the railing listening. There was a sound soft, almost like fabric brushing against a doorframe. Then the faintest flicker, light shifting, as though a lamp had been turned down low, and then caught itself again. Elias's mother's door sat cracked open at the end of the hall, just enough to see a sliver of yellow light cutting across the floorboards, just enough to invite questions without offering any answers. I didn't know her well. Not yet. We'd spoken only in small pieces, gestures instead of conversations. Her hand on my shoulder as she pinned the veil. Her eyes lingering a little too long when no one was watching. There had always been something unreadable about her. Not unkind, just guarded. Like she carried a story she hadn't decided to share with me yet. Or maybe one she hoped I'd never ask about. A shadow passed through the crack in her door, slow enough to be deliberate. Someone moving inside. Someone awake. I should have walked away, closed the door behind me, pretended I saw nothing, and felt even less. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, halfway between curiosity and unease, listening for another sound. Listening for anything that could explain why an old house suddenly felt like it was paying too much attention. I whispered his name once. Elias? Even though I knew it wasn't him, the house answered with silence. I stepped closer. Not enough to be seen. Just enough to understand the feeling building inside me. Her door wasn't open by accident. I could tell by the angle, carefully placed, not careless. Like someone wanted to appear private without actually being so. My fingers tightened around the railing, grounding myself. The hallway lights buzzed softly overhead, trembling in their sockets. The air smelled faintly of the candles she lit earlier, a blend of chamomile and something sharper, maybe rosemary. It tugged at my memory, though I couldn't place why. I stared at that door until my eyes began to ache. And in that stillness, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, more like being measured. as though someone on the other side already knew I was there and was deciding whether to acknowledge me. When the shadow moved again, it didn't startle me. It almost felt expected, like the house had been waiting for that moment. And now that it was here, it wanted me to understand something I wasn't ready to learn. The light flickered once more, then steadied. A slow inhale, a slower exhale, my own breath getting caught somewhere between my ribs. I thought about knocking, just a gentle tap, an excuse to ask if she needed anything, or to pretend I belonged in this family enough to check on her. But I didn't lift my hand. Some instinct held it down. Something deep in me whispering that the boundary between her world and mine wasn't meant to be crossed. Not yet. Not on this night. Not when the air between us felt so thin and so heavy at the same time. I stepped back, just one quiet retreating step, and the floorboard beneath me creaked louder than it should have. The sound sliced clean through the hallway. The shadow stopped moving. Completely. As though it had heard me. I held my breath without meaning to. The silence that followed felt alive, stretching, listening. Then, after a long moment, the light behind her door dimmed, as if she had moved farther from it, as if she had turned her attention toward the crack, toward me, without taking a single step. I waited for something, a voice, a question, even the soft closing of a door. But nothing came, just the house returning to its slow, deliberate breathing. I walked back to the room prepared for us, touching the wall as I passed, as though I needed proof that something solid still existed around me. And as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the quiet thought that lodged itself in my chest. Why did she seem like she was waiting for something, and why did it feel like that something had nothing to do with me? The morning light came in thin and uncertain, slipping through curtains that hadn't been washed in years. It rested on dust motes drifting lazily through the hallway, like the house was shaking off sleep, but not quite waking. I stood in the doorway, barefoot, listening to the soft creaks settling into the walls. There was something about being alone in another family's home, the way every sound felt borrowed, the way silence seemed to know your name. I took a slow breath and stepped forward, letting the house meet me on its own terms. I spent the better part of the morning wandering through the rooms, trying to make sense of a place that felt both lived in and forgotten. The wallpaper curled in thin, delicate spirals near the ceilings, almost pretty in its decay. If I touched it, I felt it would crumble like old parchment. The air carried a mix of smells. Lavender oil from a bottle his mother kept on the hallway table, mothballs tucked into corners, and something earthier too, like old wood left too long in a shaded place. A smell with years behind it. I paused in each doorway longer than necessary, letting my eyes adjust to the lighting, the colors, the shadows that lingered just a little too long in the corners. Every room felt like it had been used recently, but nothing had been moved in years. Blankets folded the same way. Frames sitting in the same dust outlines. Books with spines cracked from reading, but pages untouched since. His mother moved with a kind of quiet precision, the kind that belonged to someone who had memorized every object's place. Even now, I felt her presence in every room, an invisible hand smoothing the blankets, straightening the magazines, preserving a moment she wasn't ready to let go of. It reminded me of someone grieving, only the grief had settled into the bones of the house itself. And I felt like a guest at a wake that never officially ended. When I reached Elias's childhood room, my hand stalled on the doorknob. Not out of fear, just a small hesitation, like I needed permission from someone who wasn't there. The door opened with the softest sigh. Inside, the room felt suspended in time. Light blue walls. A twin bed with a faded quilt tucked in with the precision of a mother who hadn't quite accepted that her son no longer slept there. Shelves filled with old model cars and amateur trophies from years he never talked about. I stepped inside slowly, careful not to disturb the thin layer of dust on the desk. There was a photograph pinned above it. Elias at maybe 10 years old, a missing tooth and a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He didn't smile like that anymore. The stillness in the room pressed in around me. Not heavy, just watchful. Like the space had been waiting for someone to acknowledge it after being ignored so long. I touched the quilt with my fingertips. The fabric felt cool. untouched, as if he'd left the home suddenly and she'd preserved everything exactly as he abandoned it. Nothing here belonged to the man I married. Everything belonged to the boy he once was. I gently closed the door, careful not to let it latch too loudly. But the moment the click echoed down the hallway, another sound rose in response, a soft thud from upstairs. I froze. The house had been quiet all morning except for the natural settling of old beams, and this wasn't that. It sounded like something heavy shifting.
Or someone moving something.
Slowly, deliberately. I looked toward the staircase. The banister gleamed where someone had recently polished it, but the upper landing was caught in shadow. No light moved. No footsteps followed. I waited, counting breaths, counting seconds. Another soft thud, and this time I could feel the faint vibration through the floorboards. His mother had been up early, but I hadn't heard her walking around. The kitchen had been silent, the kettle cold. No drawers opening, no cabinets closing. No signs of her beginning her day. So what was she doing now? And why did it sound like she didn't want to be heard? I took one step toward the stairs, then stopped. Something in the air shifted, subtle and sharp, like the tension before a door opens. But nothing opened. Nothing moved. Only the faint lavender scent drifted down from above, carrying with it a quiet warning I couldn't yet name. I stayed there a long moment, one hand resting on the banister, listening as the house settled back into silence. Whatever happened upstairs, it was over.
For now.
The light filtered through the windows in slow, dusty beams, catching the corners of rooms I hadn't finished exploring. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe clicked softly, like a heartbeat trying to steady itself. I turned away from the staircase and let the quiet swallow the moment whole. But the question followed me down the hall like a shadow too long for the morning sun. What was she doing at this hour, and why did it sound like something she didn't want me to know? Sleep was just beginning to blur at the edges when I heard it, a sound soft enough to mistake for a dream, quiet enough to slip between thoughts. It rose through the vents like warm breath against the cold night, low and steady, almost deliberate. The house had been silent for hours, the kind of silence that settles on old wood and lingers in corners. But now, something threaded itself through that quiet, a rhythm that didn't belong to the night or to me. I opened my eyes and knew instantly. I wasn't imagining it. The room was dim, lit only by the soft blue haze from the street lamp outside the window. The curtains swayed just slightly, brushing against each other like tired hands. I lay still, breathing shallow, letting the sound find its shape. It wasn't the usual groan of pipes or the settling bones of an old house. This was different. A murmur. A pattern. It rose, dipped, rose again. Each cycle too intentional to belong to anything lifeless. The hair along my arms prickled as I pushed myself upright. The sheets slid from my shoulders, cool against the warm skin suddenly alive with tension. I pressed my feet to the floor, feeling the wood give under my weight as though acknowledging me. The sound came again, clear this time, almost like someone speaking beneath their breath, someone trying not to be heard, but failing. For a moment, I wondered if Elias had returned without a word, quietly speaking to his mother down the hall. But the voice wasn't his. It held age, restraint, a sharpness softened only by exhaustion. I could trace its direction through the vent grill near the baseboard. His mother's room was just down the hall, tucked into the far corner of the house like a secret. And now it felt like that secret was slipping through the walls. I stood up slowly, letting the silence of the room settle around me. The house seemed to listen, to wait. The floor was cold beneath my feet as I stepped toward the hallway. I paused at the door, hand resting on the knob, grounding myself against the sudden, unexplainable weight of the moment. Her voice rose again, still muffled, still measured, but with a rhythm I could no longer mistake for crying. This wasn't grief. It wasn't broken. It was controlled.
Steady.
Like she was reciting something. I opened the bedroom door just enough to slip into the hallway. The darkness thickened there, swallowing the faint blue glow from my room. Only a thin strip of yellow light leaked from beneath her door, stretching across the floorboards like a warning. I held my breath as I walked, My steps slow, deliberate, each one syncing itself with the strange cadence drifting through the air. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became, a whispering pattern, too low to understand but unmistakably directed at someone. Someone else. The thought stopped me in my tracks. The house was empty except for the two of us. And yet, her voice moved like it flowed around another presence, someone unseen but important enough to speak to at midnight. My pulse thudded in my ears. Still, I kept walking. I reached her door and froze just inches away. The wood looked darker here, as though the shadows clung tighter to this part of the hallway. The thin line of light beneath the door flickered. Once, twice, like a candle breathing in the dark. Her voice carried through in fragments now. Not words, exactly, but sounds shaped with purpose.
Soft.
Measured. Almost tender. I leaned in slightly. Not enough to make a sound. Just enough for the air around the door to brush my cheek. She paused. I felt the silence tighten, pulling the hallway in with it. Then her voice resumed, lower than before, like someone picking up a conversation they'd been having for years. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what she could be saying, who she could be saying it to. The tone didn't fit a prayer, or a memory, or a woman alone. It was the sound someone makes when they want the person across from them to listen.
To answer.
A faint rustle followed, fabric shifting, a footstep, maybe something heavier being moved, but with a care that made my skin prickle. In that moment, something settled into me. Not fear exactly, but a realization. She wasn't alone in there. Not in the way a person might not be alone with their thoughts. This felt different. More present. I didn't know what waited behind that door. But I knew, with a certainty that rooted me to the floor, that it wasn't meant for me to see.
Not yet.
I stepped back, one quiet movement at a time, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. Her voice softened as I retreated, or maybe the house swallowed it to keep her secret. The hallway stretched long and hollow behind me, the air cool against my skin. When I finally reached my room, I paused with my hand on the doorframe, listening one last time. The murmuring continued, steady as a heartbeat. Steady as a conversation between two people who knew each other well. I slipped inside and closed the door with a breath that felt too loud in my own chest. The sheets were still warm when I crawled beneath them, but sleep no longer sat anywhere near me. Because now I knew her voice wasn't wandering. It was answering. And I couldn't stop wondering who was speaking back. The night had settled into that thin, breathless quiet a house only finds after everyone's gone still. I lay on my back, watching the ceiling glow faintly with a street lamp outside, the light cutting a pale line across the plaster like some old scar the house didn't care to hide. I was almost asleep, caught in that soft drift where sounds feel like dreams, when something slipped through the vent beside the bed. A low murmur, rhythmic.
Steady.
Not wind. Not pipes.
Words.
I held my breath without meaning to. The moment stretched, delicate, like a thread I was afraid to pull. And then the voice came again. I sat up slowly, letting the blankets fall away from my arms. The air in the room felt cooler than it had a moment ago, as if the house itself had exhaled. The vent rattled softly, just once, and then the sound drifted through again, wrapping itself around the corners of the room. My name wasn't in it. No recognizable syllables. Just cadence, like someone reading lines from a worn-out prayer. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping across the window in a weak arc. I waited until it vanished before letting my feet touch the floor. The boards creaked, thin and high, the way they always did in older homes, little reminders that nothing goes unnoticed. Elias had fallen asleep downstairs on the couch hours before. Too tired from the drive, he'd said. Too tired to climb the stairs. His mother's door was at the other end of the hall, tucked behind a corner, half hidden, as if the house had built itself around her instead of the other way around. I stood there listening, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the voice kept coming, steady as a metronome, never rising, never breaking, not crying, not talking to herself. Something in between. I wrapped my sweater around my shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The air felt heavier there, as if dust hung in places I couldn't see. The voice grew clearer. The hall seemed longer at night. Narrower, too. Shadows pooled in places that looked harmless during the day. The family photos on the wall, those sepia-toned portraits with stiff shoulders and unsmiling mouths, watched as I walked past, their glass frames catching faint traces of light. I moved quietly, almost tiptoeing, afraid that any sudden sound would break whatever spell I'd stumbled into. Her door was closed. It usually was. But tonight, a soft strip of light glowed at the bottom, trembling slightly as though her lamp was swaying. The closer I got, the more I could make out her voice, the rhythm of it, the shape of it. She wasn't whispering, not quite speaking either. More like reciting. I stopped a few inches from the door. The wood was cool under my fingertips. Her voice drifted through in fragments, dipping and rising as though she was answering questions I couldn't hear. Yes, no, no. A pause. I know. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the words themselves. They were too faint to understand fully. It was the tone. Measured. Purposeful. Too calm to be grief. Too practiced to be madness. A floorboard shifted inside her room. Something heavy scraped softly against the floor. She didn't react.
She didn't even stop speaking.
It felt like listening to half a conversation, and the half I couldn't hear felt far too close. I leaned in, just enough that my ear brushed the door, the paint rough from years of touch. Her voice lowered, softer now, almost tender. Another pause. A whisper of movement. Fabric maybe. Or something being lifted. I swallowed hard. There was someone else in that pattern. Not a voice, not a presence exactly, but a space where a reply should have been. As if she'd left room for someone to speak back. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I didn't touch it. Something about the air told me I shouldn't. Through the door, her voice shifted again. "Don't worry," she murmured. "I'll keep it safe." A faint hum followed, almost like she was soothing a child, or reminding herself of a promise. Then, just when I thought the moment had passed, something inside her room hit the floor. A small thud, soft but clear. Not loud enough to alarm her, but enough to send a shiver along my spine. She didn't react. She just kept speaking, her tone steady, unwavering. I stepped back, the carpet brushing against my heel. In that instant, her voice paused, as if she'd heard me, as if she sensed the shift in the hallway air. I held still, barely breathed. Then she spoke again, but this time the tone was different. Lower, closer to the door. "Are you there?" she asked. I couldn't tell if she meant me, or someone else entirely. I backed away slowly, the hall swallowing each step until the dark felt gentler again. When I turned the corner, her voice started up once more, soft, rhythmic, slipping through the walls like it had been doing this every night for years. The house felt different now, more awake, more aware. I returned to my room, closing the door with a careful click, as if noise itself had become dangerous. The vent hummed faintly above me, carrying her murmured words like a draft I couldn't stop. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, heart thudding in quiet, uneasy beats. Somewhere down the hall, she kept talking, and I couldn't tell any more if she was alone. Morning arrived quietly, like it didn't want to disturb the house. Light slipped through the thin kitchen curtains in soft, uneven stripes, settling on the tablecloth in pale patches. Dust floated in the beams, slow and patient, drifting as though the air itself had just woken. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. The kettle clicked, a chair creaked, and there she was, already seated, already pouring tea, her movements calm in a way that felt almost too careful, like she'd been awake much longer than the morning had. For a breath, I waited for some sign of the night before. But her face was unreadable. Still water, hiding something deep beneath. The kitchen smelled faintly of mint leaves and old wood. A comforting scent on any other morning, but today it sat oddly in the air, too light, too clean, as if it was covering something else. She didn't look up when I walked in, just motioned to the chair across from her with a small, habitual tilt of her hand, the kind that felt more like muscle memory than genuine invitation. I sat slowly, careful not to scrape the chair legs. The quiet felt thin, stretched tight between us. Steam curled from her cup in soft spirals. She watched it rise with an attentiveness that felt intentional, like she had trained herself to focus on harmless things. "You sleep well?" she asked. The question floated out lightly, but her tone didn't quite reach me. I nodded anyway. "Mostly." "Good," she murmured, eyes still lowered. The night before hovered in my mind, the murmuring through the vent, her voice slipping through the dark, the way she paused at her door as if listening for something on the other side. I watched her now, searching for any trace of that moment. But she held herself steady, shoulders straight, hands deliberate. Almost practiced, like someone performing the idea of mourning. She reached for the sugar bowl, fingers brushing the porcelain with familiar ease. Nothing in her movements suggested she'd been awake whispering to unseen company hours earlier. Nothing suggested she'd heard me in the hallway. Still, her eyes didn't meet mine. Not once. I cleared my throat gently. "Have you seen Elias today?" The spoon stilled in her hand, but only for a heartbeat. She set it against the cup's rim and let it clink softly, almost thoughtfully. "He'll return when he can," she said, her voice smooth, almost polished. The words slipped out too quickly, as if she'd said them before. Many times. I waited, but she offered nothing more. Her hands returned to her cup, slow, steady, as if stirring tea required all her attention. The sunlight touched her sleeve, revealing a faint tremble in her wrist she tried to mask. Something caught my eye. On her right hand, across the knuckles, thin red scrapes, fresh enough to look tender, old enough to have dried at the edges. Small, uneven marks. Not the kind you get from cooking, not from gardening either. I watched quietly, letting the discovery settle like cold water in my chest. She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, hiding the injury, but not before I'd memorized it. The room felt still in a way that made each sound land heavier than it should. The ticking wall clock, the soft tap of her spoon, the faint distant hum of the refrigerator. Everything else, the questions, the worry, hung suspended between us. I tried to keep my tone light. "Did you hurt your hand?" Her stirring stopped. Just for a moment. Barely enough to notice. "Unless you were looking for it." "Oh," she said, glancing down as though noticing the injury for the first time. "Just clumsy, I suppose." But the words fell strangely, like she was reading them off a cue card she'd used before. "Must have scraped it on a drawer." Another pause. "Or something outside." Her voice didn't match the story. Too even. Too calm. Outside? It had been raining the night before. The ground still wet. The tools in the shed untouched for weeks. Elias mentioned that. She finally lifted her gaze, but only to the window behind me, not to my eyes. She blinked slowly, almost deliberately, as though focusing on a point far beyond the yard. "You shouldn't worry about me," she whispered, tone softening just enough to sound motherly. "There are things in this house that have worn down over time. Edges. Corners." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Sometimes they bite back." She said it lightly, but something colder lived beneath the words. Her hand tightened around her cup, knuckles whitening, scraped skin stretching. And I realized she wasn't trying to hide the injury. She was hiding the reason for it. The tea between us cooled slowly, ribbons of steam fading into the morning light. She didn't drink, just held the cup like it grounded her. I watched the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Measured, controlled, like the voice I'd heard through the vent. Outside, a small breeze tugged at the window pane. The curtain swayed, brushing the edge of the table. She followed the movement with her eyes, not her head, as though turning too far might reveal something she didn't want seen. Her scraped knuckles trembled once before she stilled them. "He'll return when he can," she repeated softly. But the house felt too quiet, too expectant, as though it knew something neither of us would say out loud. And sitting there, watching her carefully orchestrated calm, I realized morning hadn't washed the night away. It had only made the questions clearer. The message arrived just as the afternoon light began to thin, one of those soft, washed out moments when the world feels half asleep. My phone buzzed once against the table, a small sound in a big, quiet house. I remember staring at the screen for a long time before opening it, as if the weight of that tiny vibration could tip something inside me. Elias's name glowed in pale blue. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." No warmth, no punctuation that felt like him. Just a line that read more like a memo than reassurance. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the old siding of the house, and suddenly it felt like everything around me was holding its breath. I tried calling him right away. The ring barely started before it cut to voicemail, his voice too cheerful, too practiced, the same recording he'd made years ago. It felt wrong hearing it now, echoing through a kitchen that didn't feel like mine. I stepped outside, letting the door ease shut behind me. The air was cool, almost sharp, like it had been filtered through pine needles. For a moment, I stood on the back stoop, letting the quiet settle around me. The house looked different from out here. Older, like its corners sagged under something heavy and unspoken. Beyond the patch of overgrown grass, I noticed a shape I hadn't seen before. A shed, small, wooden, leaning slightly to one side. The kind of structure that disappeared into the background unless you knew to look for it. Its door was cracked open, just enough for the afternoon light to spill through in a thin, slanting line. I hesitated at the edge of the yard. The ground was soft beneath my shoes, still damp from last night's rain. The air smelled faintly of earth and something metallic, carried on a breeze that barely stirred the tall grass. I told myself I only wanted fresh air, but my feet kept moving toward the shed. Something about that door, the way it waited, just slightly open, felt like an unfinished sentence. The hinges groaned softly when I pushed the door wider. Inside, the air shifted. Cool, still, heavy with the scent of metal and damp wood. It smelled like forgotten winters and untouched corners. A quiet swallowed the space, the kind that settles in places people rarely visit. Tools hung on the walls with strange precision. Not just organized, curated. Each one placed carefully, the handles polished, the metal gleaming faintly despite the dust. A rake, a hatchet, a set of wrenches, gardening shears, each perfectly aligned along thin nails hammered into the wood. Nothing about this room matched the rest of the house's soft decay. I stepped farther in, my hand brushing the edge of the workbench. The wood felt worn smooth, as if touched often, recently. That unsettled me, not because the tools were kept so carefully, but because someone had tended them in a house that felt otherwise untouched by time. On the table, beneath a coil of rope and a folded tarp, something caught my eye. The corner of a photograph. I slid it free carefully, brushing sawdust from the surface. It was Elias, maybe 15, maybe 16. His hair longer, falling across his forehead, a shy smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. He looked softer then, before adulthood carved sharper lines into him. But my eyes were drawn not to him, but to the empty space beside him. Another figure had once stood there. I could still see the outline of a body, the faint shape of a shoulder. But the face had been scratched out, violently. Deep grooves tearing across the glossy surface, cutting so hard the paper had nearly split. I held the photo closer, angling it toward the narrow beam of light leaking in from the doorway. The scratches had depth, as if someone had gone over them again and again, carving out the presence of whoever once lingered beside him. The marks felt recent. My thumb traced the torn edges. The paper crinkled softly, betraying its age, but the vandalism was fresh. The ink around the scratches still looked raw, the lines harsh against the otherwise smooth print. Behind me, the shed door rattled lightly in the wind. I turned, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the yard was still. Even the grass seemed unmoving. I looked back at the photograph. The missing figure, whoever they were, had stood close to Elias. Their shoulder brushed his, the intimacy unmistakable. A friend? A sibling? Someone he never mentioned? Or someone no one wanted remembered? Why erase a face so intentionally? Why here? Why now? I set the photo down gently on the workbench, but it shifted slightly, catching on a splinter. Something underneath it caught my eye. A faint impression burned into the wood grain. Letters. The bottom edge of a name, maybe, or initials. Too faint to read. I leaned closer, heart tapping slowly, rhythmically in my chest. A floorboard creaked somewhere outside the shed. A single, deliberate groan of old wood shifting under weight. Not wind. Not the house settling. It sounded like footsteps approaching. I straightened, breath quieting. Someone else knew this place. Someone else had been here recently. I stepped back toward the door, the photograph still warm in my hand. The air outside felt different now, cooler, sharpened by the faintest hint of unease. The house loomed in the distance, windows dark, watching. I turned the photo over. No date. No writing. Just the faintest smear of dirt along the back, as if it had been handled with unsteady fingers. I slipped it into my pocket before I fully understood why. The grass rustled near the side of the shed, just a quick whisper of movement. Too soft to be certain, but enough to make me pause. In the fading light, the shed behind me seemed to exhale slowly, like it had been waiting for someone to notice what it held. And as I walked back toward the house, one question followed me like a shadow. Who was standing beside Elias in that photograph? And why did someone need to erase them? The sound came back just after midnight. Not the house settling, not the wind tracing its fingers along the siding. This was sharper, rhythmic, like something being dragged across a floor that didn't want to give it up. I lay still, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight was thin, barely touching the corners of the room. And in that pale silence, her voice rose, soft, strained, then snapped off so suddenly the air seemed to fold in on itself. A moment later, I heard a door open somewhere down the hall.
Just a small click.
But in a house this quiet, even a breath can sound like a confession. Nights here have their own temperature. Not cold, exactly. Just hollow. Like the walls keep too many memories and not enough warmth. I'd been sleeping lightly ever since I arrived, half listening to the pipes and the branches scraping the roof. But the noises tonight were different. Intentional. Measured. I pushed the blanket aside and sat up, feeling the floorboards cool against my feet. The clock on the dresser blinked 12:41, its blue light pulsing like a tired heartbeat. I rubbed my hands together, trying to wake some courage into them. The hallway was a long sleeve of darkness. No lamps, no nightlights, just that faint silver glow from the window at the far end, stretching like a thin promise. I told myself I was being foolish, that old houses hum and shift and speak in their own ways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound I heard had purpose. I stepped out, careful not to let the door latch click behind me. Every time the floor creaked under my weight, I paused, waiting for another voice, another movement. But the house held its breath, and I followed its silence. It wasn't until I passed the second guest room that I saw it, a thin line of light slipping out from under the door near the end of the hall. Not bright, just enough to bend the darkness. Then movement. A shadow crossing through that light, slow and deliberate. As if whoever was inside wasn't rushing, just following a practiced routine. A soft thump, like something being set down. Then the sound again. That dragging, scraping pull. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hand against the wall, grounding myself with something solid. The doorknob turned. A faint metal whisper. The door opened just enough for a figure to slip out. She didn't see me. She never looked up. Her silhouette moved like she was made of smoke. Quiet, purposeful. She held something bundled in dark cloth, long and narrow, the weight of it uneven. Her grip adjusted once, twice, as though whatever lay inside shifted against her. Her bare feet made almost no sound on the wooden floor, but the boards responded anyway, groaning under the secret she carried. She headed toward the end of the hall, turning right, toward the basement stairs. My heart followed before my feet did. I should have gone back to my room, closed the door,
Pretended none of this belonged to me.
but the way she moved, the way her shoulders stayed tight, pulled inward like she was bracing for something, it felt like an invitation wrapped in fear. I crept behind her, keeping to the shadows, letting distance be my only shield. She stopped at the top of the basement steps. For a moment, she didn't move at all, just stood there, holding that wrapped thing against her chest. I could see the tension in her fingers, white-knuckled, holding on or holding back. I couldn't tell. Then she exhaled, a sound so small it barely reached me. She shifted the bundle, tucking one end under her arm. Her free hand reached for the light switch, but didn't flip it. Instead, she opened the basement door just wide enough to slip through. Dark swallowed her whole. I stood there, staring at the gap she left behind, my hand trembling as I reached for the frame. The wood felt warm, worn by years of hands I didn't know. I leaned closer, listening. Below, something moved. Soft. Unsteady. Like fabric sliding over concrete. Or breath trapped inside a room with no windows. Why did she only move like this when she thought no one saw? What lived in the dark with her? And why did it sound like it knew she was coming? I didn't go down the stairs. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, step by careful step, never taking my eyes off that thin slice of darkness between the door and its frame. The house felt heavier now, every shadow thicker, every silence deeper. When I reached my room, I closed the door without a sound, leaned against it, listened to my heartbeat, loud and uneven, like it was trying to warn me of something it didn't have words for. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, I heard it again, that dragging rhythm. Slow, patient, unsettling. I lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. But the dark felt like it had only just begun to speak. Morning came slow, like the light wasn't sure it wanted to touch this house. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with my hand on the knob, half expecting it to turn the way it always had. But it didn't move. Not even a little. Locked. The quiet around me thickened, settling across my shoulders like a damp quilt. Down below, the dark felt deeper somehow, heavier. Almost listening. When I asked her about it, she didn't look at me, said the door had always been that way. Her voice light, too light, like a sheet pulled over something she didn't want me to see. And the morning, fragile as it was, seemed to hold its breath. Breakfast was a slow, uneven ritual, the kind where every sound, the clink of her spoon, the soft scrape of her chair against the tile, the faucet dripping in its own tired rhythm, felt louder than it should have been. She moved around the kitchen with a kind of practiced ease, but her shoulders were tight, drawn up closer to her ears, like she was carrying too many memories in her bones, ones she'd never say out loud. She kept her eyes on the sink, on the window, anywhere but me. "You slept okay?" she asked once, but the words didn't have a home in her mouth. They floated empty between us. "Fine," I lied. Something in her jaw tightened, so small I might have missed it if the morning light hadn't caught the movement. She rinsed her hands longer than needed, dried them slowly on the towel. "I've got errands in town," she said. "I'll be back this afternoon." She left without taking her tea. The cup sat on the table, steam thinning in the air, like even it didn't have the strength to rise. When the door closed behind her, the house fell into a silence that felt more honest. A silence that invited questions, and left too much room for their answers. I walked through the living room with that silence trailing behind me. The curtains were half open, letting in strips of pale sun that painted the walls in long, tired rectangles. Something felt off. Not wrong, just shifted. As if the house had exhaled the moment she stepped outside, revealing a shape it had been hiding. I moved the couch a few inches to straighten a crooked rug. That's when I heard it, a soft, hollow tap behind the frame. I froze. Tapped again. The sound answered. A loose board, the kind that didn't come undone on its own. I knelt down, fingers tracing the edge where the wood didn't sit flush. It lifted too easily, revealing a narrow space, dark and thin as a secret. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper was soft at the edges, creased so many times it looked tired of being opened and closed. My name wasn't on it, but Elias's was, written in a trembling hand, letters leaning too far to one side. I hesitated, the weight of the house pressing in. Then I unfolded it, careful not to tear the fragile lines. The first sentence stopped the air in my chest. I'm sorry about last time. Just those words. But they felt like the basement door the night before. A truth locked away, and someone pretending it had always been like that. I read the line again. Each word seemed to sink deeper into the paper. Into me. Last time. 2 small words, but heavy as a stone dropped into still water. What had happened before I ever stepped foot in this family? Before Elias left without saying much at all? The letter trembled slightly in my hand. Or maybe that was me. The rest of the page was blank, either unfinished or scrubbed clean of whatever came after. I pressed my thumb along the crease, feeling the indentation of ink that had been written with a shaking hand. Someone had struggled through this apology. Someone who felt the need to hide it behind a wall. I placed the board back loosely, not forcing it closed. The couch slid into place with a low sigh. I stood in the center of the room for a long moment, watching dust move through the sunlight like drifting thoughts, slow, quiet, impossible to hold. Her tension that morning made more sense now. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it only added another thread to the knot. And Elias, his messages, his silence, his leaving before I understood what leaving meant. Everything felt connected. Like the shadows in this house weren't separate at all, but part of the same shape. A shape I was only starting to see. Outside, her car returned before I expected it. The gravel crunched under her tires in a way that made my pulse skip. I folded the letter once more and slipped it into my pocket. Not to hide it,
Just to keep it close.
the doorknob turned. Her footsteps crossed the entryway, steady, measured. But something in them felt cautious, as if she sensed the house shifting in her absence. I didn't move. The sunlight had shifted by then, leaving the living room in a soft, muted gray. When she stepped inside, her eyes swept the room. Not searching, just checking. And for the first time, I wondered if the basement wasn't the only locked door in this house. If there were others, quiet ones, that I had only just begun to find. And what else might be hidden behind the walls? The afternoon light fell in thin, dusty lines across the hallway, catching on the edges of drawers I hadn't opened in years or ever. It felt like the house was watching me again, the way a tired animal watches someone cross its territory.
Quiet.
Cautious. Waiting. I rested my hand on the first drawer, the wood warm from the sun, and pulled. Old paper breathed out a faint smell of time. Ink. Glue. Something like lost summers. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Only that the answers in this house were never given. They were tucked away, hidden like bruises under long sleeves. And today, I finally had the courage to look. The living room felt different without her in it. Lighter almost. Like her absence softened the walls and unhooked the shadows from the corners. I moved through the room slowly, as though disturbing the air too quickly might stir up something better left still. A stack of forgotten albums sat under the coffee table, edges curled from heat or grief. I couldn't tell which. The drawers beneath the old sideboard held more than silverware or table linens. They held stories, ones she never offered, even when the silence between us stretched thin enough to hear her heartbeat through it. One photograph at a time, I tried to stitch together the family I'd stepped into, Elias with his shy smile, his mother with her careful posture, and a boy I'd never seen before. His name appeared in neat handwriting on the back of a church group photo. Samuel, a little taller than Elias, with the same serious eyes. I traced the date with my thumb. It was from 15 years ago, back when her smile looked easier, as if life hadn't yet taught her to brace for every moment like it might break. The more pictures I found, the more I realized something simple and heartbreaking. They used to be 4, but only 2 remained, and no one had ever told me why. I spread the photographs across the floor, the old rug whispering under my knees as I shifted them into a loose timeline. Smiles faded slowly from year to year. Samuel grew older in each frame until, suddenly, he didn't. One year he was 18, standing tall beside Elias. The next year, nothing. No graduation photo. No holidays. No candid moments with mismatched sweaters or backyard sunlight. It was like he slipped out of the pictures the same way he slipped out of their lives, quietly, without explanation. I opened a narrow drawer I hadn't noticed before. Inside were papers, yellowed at the edges, a few curled envelopes with handwriting I recognized from the letter behind the couch. Her handwriting, shaken, thin, like it had been written in a trembling breath. A school report, a hospital bill, a counseling appointment card, never torn from its perforated edge. Then a thin folder, just one page inside. Missing person report, Samuel H. Rowe, age 19. My breath caught, a soft, fragile sound in the still room. I read the date. My stomach tightened. The report was filed the same month she started locking the basement door, according to the records tucked beneath. I thought of her moving through the house at night, whispering to shadows, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Her knuckles scraped raw, and suddenly the timeline began to blur into something she hadn't told me. Something she hadn't told anyone. The final drawer stuck a little, as if hesitating. I pulled gently until it gave way with a tired sigh. Inside was a single photograph, not stored in an envelope, not tucked safely between papers, just lying there, loose, as if it had been placed deliberately where someone might one day find it. I lifted it out carefully. Samuel again. Older in this one. 19 maybe. Shoulders broader, expression more distant. But it wasn't his face that stopped me. It was where he stood. The setting behind him recognizable in an instant. The basement doorway. The same angle I'd seen her silhouette at the night she crept downstairs carrying that dark bundle. The same threshold I'd seen her linger at with a tenderness that didn't match the fear she carried now. Her son, frozen in a moment before he vanished, standing in the doorway she still visited when she believed herself alone. Was she looking for him? Still? After all these years? Or was she talking to him in those soft midnight murmurs I'd heard through the vents? Not in madness, but in mourning too deep for daylight to allow. My fingers tightened around the edges of the photo, the glossy surface bending slightly under the weight of everything it held. The house felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer, the air thick with something like grief. Something I had almost mistaken for superstition or strangeness. Something I now understood as love that never found a place to rest. I placed the photo gently on the floor, letting it settle among the others. The boy who disappeared. The mother who never let him go. The brother who grew up beside a silence he couldn't escape. Outside, a truck passed on the road, its rumble drifting in like a slow reminder that life continued elsewhere. Normal. Unbroken. I sat back on my heels, the sunlight fading to a cooler shade as clouds moved across the sky. It struck me then, her nightly movements, her whispered prayers, her hidden letters, they weren't secrets meant to deceive. They were the only pieces she had left of a child who never came home. And as the house settled around me, a soft, weary sound, I realized one more truth. Whatever she thought was in that basement, she wasn't running from it. She was returning to it, night after night. The house was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. The moon was thin, pale, brushing the edges of the curtains with a soft, uncertain light. I lay in bed, counting the slow, steady thrum of my own heartbeat, trying to will it quieter. Then, from the hallway, I heard it, the faint creak of floorboards moving under careful feet. The way she moved was deliberate, practiced, as if she had rehearsed this journey countless nights before I arrived. My pulse sped. I didn't move. I only watched the shadow slip past my doorway, small and silent, carrying some invisible weight. And I followed. The hall smelled faintly of varnish and dust, the air cooler than my room, carrying a hush that belonged only to the night. I stepped lightly, listening to the soft scrape of her slippers, each one a whisper against the wood. Every corner held its own shadow, stretching and folding, making the house feel larger and lonelier than it had in daylight. I felt my chest tighten, as though the quiet had weight. I imagined her moving years of memory in each step. Old regrets, soft prayers, the kind of grief that bends a body inward until it learns to carry itself like a secret. I thought about Samuel, the son I'd only discovered through old photographs and letters. And now, for the first time, I might hear the names spoken aloud. I slowed, pausing at the top of the basement stairs, my hand hovering near the wall for balance. The doorknob gleamed faintly in the thin light, cold and familiar. I felt the house hold its breath with me, waiting, patient. Her shadow disappeared behind the door, and a low click echoed in the stillness. I swallowed. The air was heavier here, thick with something I couldn't name, an unspoken history pressed into wood and plaster. She unlocked the basement door carefully, as if the sound of metal scraping metal could wake the past. I stayed back, letting the shadows keep me hidden, heart hammering against ribs that didn't feel like my own. The basement was different from the upper floors. Cold, damp, smelling faintly of concrete and must, but also something sweet. Lavender? Mothballs? A single lamp glowed near the center, casting long, hesitant shadows across boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. It felt like a world suspended, holding its breath. She knelt at the edge of the light, hands folded around something invisible. Then I heard it, soft at first, a voice trembling yet steady. Samuel. The sound made the room feel alive. Not with ghosts, exactly, but with presence. Someone had lived here, in memory alone. And that someone was her. She shifted, whispering again, running fingers along the back of a chair, a tabletop, nothing I could see. Her tone was gentle, comforting, like she was speaking to someone real but unreachable. I wondered if the nights had been like this for years, a private ritual of love and loss. The light from the lamp flickered, and I realized how small I felt in the space, how far removed from the grief she had learned to carry alone. I took a careful step forward, careful not to let the floorboards betray me. The shadows shifted with me, and I saw her profile more clearly. Her eyes glistened, reflecting the single bulb's yellow light, but not toward me. They never looked at me. She whispered Samuel's name again, and this time I heard more. Fragments of words, incomplete sentences, perhaps prayers or apologies. Come back. I'm here. I'm sorry. The words hung between the walls, settling like dust. I wanted to speak, to ask something simple, but my voice felt too loud, too alive. This was not my grief. It was hers, and it demanded solitude. I watched her rock gently, arms around the empty air as if holding him close, shaping the absence into comfort. The lamp's light softened every line of her face, the way it tightened around her mouth, the small slump of her shoulders that day could not correct. I understood then that the basement was not just a room.
It was a sanctuary.
A stage where grief became tangible, where love and loss could meet without interruption. She whispered his name once more, and in that single syllable, I felt everything she had carried for 19 years. Every locked door, every silent night, every letter tucked away in hidden drawers. I backed away slowly, letting the shadows swallow me again. The house was silent, except for the hum of the lamp and the quiet rhythm of her whispers. I returned to my room, closing the door softly behind me. The moonlight shifted across the floorboards, pale and hesitant. I lay in bed, the name Samuel repeating in my mind, along with her murmured apologies and her invisible embrace. Somewhere beneath the house, she was speaking to him still. Not to warn, not to scare, not to punish. Just to remember. And to hold. The dark seemed less empty now. It held a story too heavy for daylight. And I knew the house, and her, would wait through it all. Until the next night. Until the next whisper. The basement smelled of cold concrete and damp wood, the air heavy with shadows that clung to the corners. I stepped into the faint circle of lamplight, and for the first time, she saw me. Her eyes widened, startled, as though the secret she carried had been weighing on her body for years and suddenly had room to breathe. There was exhaustion there, deep and slow, the kind that doesn't leave even when the world is still. She didn't speak at first, only leaned against the workbench, knuckles white, silent. And in that pause, I felt everything the house had been holding, the hidden letters, the locked doors, the whispered names, all converge into one quiet, trembling moment. The basement was both sanctuary and tomb. Boxes draped in white sheets leaned like old ghosts against the walls. The single lamp flickered faintly, casting soft, unsteady light on her face. Shadows danced across her hands, revealing lines etched from years of worry and sleepless nights. I could hear it now, the soft creaks of the floorboards, the settling of the house, the low hum of the lamp. All of it felt deliberate, as if the air itself waited for her confession. She exhaled slowly, a sound that trembled through the cold, and I realized how much she had carried alone. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, tracing invisible patterns in the dust. And in the silence between us, I understood the weight of Samuel's absence, the son who had vanished, leaving more than just empty rooms behind. I shifted slightly, careful not to break the fragile rhythm of the moment. She hadn't noticed me yet, or perhaps she had simply chosen not to acknowledge me. The house seemed to hold its breath, and I did too. Finally, she looked up, and in her eyes I saw the line between memory and madness blur. A line that had shaped every night, every whisper, every locked door in this house. I hear him sometimes, she said, voice low, almost trembling. I don't know if it's Samuel, or what's left of him, or just me. Her fingers traced the edge of the workbench as though the wood could anchor her to reality. I stepped closer, careful to let the light wash over me without startling her. I didn't mean to interrupt. I whispered, but she waved the thought away. Elias. The name slipped out before I could stop it. She flinched, then leaned back, as if finally admitting something she had carried in silence.
He left, she said.
Elias. He left to find answers. To understand Samuel. He couldn't stay. He feared I'd lose myself in this basement, in the memories, in the whispers. Her voice cracked at the edge, small and quiet, the tremor barely catching the lamplight. I realized then that the nights I had feared, those strange sounds, the whispers, the movements, were not meant to scare. They were her way of holding on, of keeping what was gone alive in some fragile, impossible way. She paused, looking at the floor, her eyes dark and steady. The basement seemed larger somehow, filled with all the years she had hidden, the sorrow that had grown between the walls. I felt it pressing against me, gentle but insistent, demanding that I understand without question. I sat on the cold concrete, letting the shadows swallow part of me, and watched her. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap, knuckles scraped and raw from nights I would never witness. I don't know where the line is anymore, she said. Memory to grief, madness. I hear him, sometimes calling, sometimes laughing, sometimes just breathing. And I can't tell if it's him, or just the house echoing what I want to hear. I thought of the nights I had lain awake, hearing footsteps, whispers, names carried through vents and floorboards. I had feared danger, fear itself. But now I understood. Those sounds were the imprint of a grief that never healed, a love that refused to rest. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort or reason, but words felt too loud. Instead, I let the silence hold me beside her, the weight of her sorrow settling alongside mine. She glanced toward the single basement window. Pale dawn had begun to seep through, softening the shadows, gilding the dust in a faint golden haze. The room felt like it had exhaled finally, letting light in where it had been shut out for decades. Her voice softened as she whispered Samuel's name again, and I realized she was not speaking to me, or even to the past. She was speaking to the memory itself, letting the boy live one last night, safe in the basement, safe in her grief. The dawn light stretched across the floorboards, turning the shadows long and gentle. She sat quietly, leaning back against the workbench, her eyes distant but at peace. I could see the lines of exhaustion softened by acceptance, the rawness of grief tempered by years of devotion. Elias's absence hung in the air, a reminder that some questions cannot be answered. But here, in the basement, memory and love coexisted, fragile, unbroken, and honest. I rose slowly, stepping back into the edge of shadow, careful not to disturb her sanctuary. The first birds of morning called outside. The house held its breath for one final moment, then settled into quiet. And I knew, as the light spread across the walls, that this family's journey was far from over. Not just for Samuel, not just for Elias, not just for her, but for all of us learning to live with what can't be changed. Somewhere in the house, grief had become a kind of truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.